Get that housekeeper away from my mother. The Mafia Boss's command echoed through the bedroom before anyone dared to move. Only moments earlier, his mother's physicians had quietly informed him that nothing had changed. After nearly 2 years of silence, she still refused to speak, barely recognized the people around her, and showed no sign that another expensive treatment would succeed. Then, the impossible happened. A temporary housekeeper, filling in after the elderly woman's personal maid had called in sick, was changing the bed linens when she found an old leather poetry journal beneath the bed. Smiling to herself, she absent-mindedly read a few faded lines while putting the room back in order. The old woman suddenly stood, reached for the stranger's hand, and whispered through trembling lips, "You came back, my daughter." When the Mafia boss rushed forward to pull the young woman away, his mother slapped him across the face. Then she looked straight into his eyes and quietly said, "If you let this girl leave again, I will never forgive you." No one in that room understood why she had said again. The young housekeeper had never met her, or so everyone believed. The Whitmore estate had a reputation that reached far beyond the city's skyline. People spoke of its owner in lowered voices. Politicians treated him with unusual respect. Business rivals avoided provoking him. Even those who had never met Nathaniel Whitmore knew one thing. He was a man who solved problems quickly, permanently, and without ever raising his voice. Yet, there was one battle he had been losing every single day for nearly 2 years. It waited behind the double doors of the mansion's east wing. Every morning followed the same routine. At precisely 9, a team of specialists gathered inside Margaret Whitmore's private suite. A neurologist reviewed her latest scans. A psychiatrist tried to encourage conversation. A private nurse patiently prepared breakfast and medication. Every morning ended exactly the same way. Margaret remained silent. Some days, she stared through the tall garden windows for hours without blinking. Some days, she ignored every voice around her, as though she lived somewhere no one else could reach. The woman who had once hosted charity galas recited poetry from memory and remembered every employee's birthday, now barely recognized her own reflection. Her son never missed a consultation. He listened to every medical report without interruption, thanked every specialist for their effort, and approved every new treatment without asking about the cost. Money had never been the problem. Hope was becoming one. That Tuesday's consultation lasted less than 20 minutes. When the lead neurologist closed his folder, the silence in the room carried more weight than his words. "I'm afraid there has been no significant improvement." Nathaniel stood beside the fireplace, his hands resting calmly behind his back. "And your recommendation?" "We continue the current treatment plan." "You said that last month." "Because it's still our best option." A faint sigh escaped the older physician. "We're treating a trauma we still don't fully understand." Nathaniel looked toward his mother. She sat motionless in her favorite chair, sunlight falling gently across her silver hair. She didn't react to his voice. She didn't react to the doctors. She didn't even look up when the nurse quietly removed the untouched breakfast tray. For a brief moment, the room became painfully still. Finally, Nathaniel nodded once. "Thank you for coming." The consultation was over. The specialists slowly gathered their files and walked into the hallway. No one spoke until the bedroom door closed behind them. The estate manager was already waiting. "Sir, what is it?" "Mrs. Whitmore's personal housekeeper called this morning." Nathaniel looked up. "Is she all right?" "High fever." He nodded. "Send someone else." "We've already arranged a replacement." Grace Bennett had expected an ordinary workday. She had barely finished changing into her uniform when her supervisor from the housekeeping agency handed her a different assignment. "Luxury residential client. Big house. You could fit your apartment building inside it." Grace laughed. "That big?" Her supervisor didn't smile. "The family expects absolute professionalism. No conversations, no photographs, no curiosity. If they ask you to clean a room, you clean the room. If they ask you to leave, you leave." 20 minutes later, Grace stood in front of the largest gates she had ever seen. Security cameras followed her car before it even stopped. A guard checked her identification twice. Another scanned the work order. Only then did the gates begin to open. She looked through the windshield. "Okay," she whispered to herself. "Maybe this is the royal family." Inside the mansion, Everything seemed impossibly quiet. The estate manager led her to the east wing. The lady of the house is unwell. You'll be replacing her personal housekeeper today, changing the bedding, organizing the room. If Mrs. Whitmore becomes distressed, leave immediately. If Mr. Whitmore enters, step aside. Grace smiled. I know how to stay invisible. The room surprised her. Books lined the walls. Fresh flowers stood by the window. Family photographs rested on a nearby table. Only the silence felt unnatural. Margaret sat by the window, watching birds in the garden. Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore. Nothing. Grace quietly unpacked the fresh linens. As she lifted one side of the mattress, something slipped onto the floor. A small leather notebook. The cover was worn smooth with age. Several pages had folded corners. One page looked especially worn. She smiled. Someone clearly had a favorite. Years ago, Grace had studied literature before leaving college to support her younger brother. Old habits never truly disappeared. Without thinking, she softly read the first few lines while continuing to make the bed. Not as a performance, not for anyone else. Simply because beautiful words had always sounded better when spoken aloud. Outside the room, Nathaniel walked the doctors toward the hallway. Inside, Grace turned another page. The poet really loved impossible promises, she murmured. I wonder if anyone ever kept one. Behind her, a chair creaked. She slowly turned. For the first time, Margaret Whitmore was looking directly at her. The old woman's trembling hands gripped the chair. She struggled to stand. Grace instinctively stepped closer. Mrs. Whitmore. The elderly woman's lips trembled. Then, with tears gathering in eyes that had forgotten how to cry, she reached toward Grace and whispered, You came. The Whitmore estate slowly settled into a routine no one had expected. Every morning, the medical team still arrived. The neurologist checked Margaret's reflexes. The psychiatrist asked gentle questions. The nurses recorded every meal and every hour of sleep. But there was one difference. No one rushed Grace anymore. The doctors had learned something remarkable. Whenever they treated Margaret like a patient, she withdrew. Whenever Grace treated her like an ordinary woman, she came alive. On her third morning, Grace arrived carrying a paper bag. You brought something? I did. Medicine. Worse. She pulled out a crossword puzzle book. I thought I'd torture you with vocabulary. Margaret smiled. I cheat, Grace confessed. At crosswords, at everything. I always start with the easy clues. That's strategy. I like you already, Margaret chuckled. Outside the room, the psychiatrist quietly wrote another note. Spontaneous humor. Grace never forced conversation. She filled the room with ordinary life. She complained about the weather, read old novels, argued with fictional characters. I've been too busy paying rent to fall in love. Margaret laughed again. The doctors eventually stopped observing from inside the room. Instead, they watched quietly from outside. One afternoon, the psychiatrist said to Nathaniel, Notice something. My mother is speaking. No, she's joking, correcting, having opinions. Those are much more complicated functions. Nathaniel gradually developed a habit. Every afternoon, he somehow found himself standing outside his mother's bedroom. You can come in, Grace called. I wasn't standing here. You've been there for 3 minutes. I was walking in place. Even the nurses struggled not to smile. You could ask her, Grace said. Nathaniel looked at his mother. How are you feeling? Margaret answered after a moment. Better. It was the first time she had answered him directly in nearly 2 years. Neither spoke again. They were both afraid the moment might disappear. Later that evening, rain began tapping softly against the windows. Grace closed one before the wind scattered the pages of the old poetry journal. When she turned back, Margaret was staring into the rain. Her expression had changed. She whispered only one word, rain. Grace gently covered her hand. Neither woman spoke again. Outside the observation room, the doctors exchanged uncertain glances. No one knew whether that single word meant nothing or everything. Nathaniel watched silently. For the first time, he chose patience instead of answers. Some memories returned one fragment at a time. Rain returned 3 days later. It wasn't a storm, just a quiet, steady rain that blurred the gardens beyond Margaret Whitmore's bedroom windows. Grace noticed the change almost immediately. Whenever rain touched the glass, Margaret became unusually quiet. She no longer reached for the crossword puzzle. She barely glanced at the poetry journal. Instead, she simply watched the water slide down the window panes as though each drop carried a memory she couldn't quite catch. Grace didn't interrupt. During the past week, she had learned something the doctors hadn't. Silence wasn't always empty. Sometimes silence meant Margaret was listening to something no one else could hear. "You don't have to remember today," Grace said softly while pouring tea. "You can remember tomorrow." Margaret didn't answer. Her fingers rested lightly against the porcelain cup. Then, almost absent-mindedly, she traced a circle along its rim. Once, twice, 3 times. Grace frowned. It wasn't random. It looked like a habit, a familiar movement, the same movement someone makes while waiting. "For someone?" Grace asked, without expecting an answer. Margaret's hand stopped. Her eyes remained fixed on the rain. "So cold." The words escaped before she seemed aware she had spoken them. Grace looked up. The nurse outside the room looked toward the psychiatrist. Neither of them moved. Nobody wanted to interrupt. That evening, Nathaniel asked for every observation made during the past 7 days. The reports covered almost 40 pages. Blood pressure, heart rate, appetite, sleep, medication. He ignored most of them. Instead, he underlined every sentence Margaret had spoken. There weren't many. Better. Rain. So cold. Don't let go. You came back. He stared at the page for a long time. They weren't random words. They felt connected, like torn pages from the same story. The following morning, Nathaniel called his chief of security into the study before sunrise. "I need information." The older man nodded. "About Miss Bennett?" Nathaniel remained silent for several seconds. Finally, he answered. "Not about the woman she is. I want to know who she was." The investigation began quietly. No private detectives followed Grace. No one searched her apartment. Nathaniel had no interest in invading her present. He wanted only one thing: the truth. Boxes of archived employment records arrived first. Nothing unusual. School transcripts, scholarship applications, part-time jobs. Every document described the same person, excellent grades, no disciplinary history, left university after her father's death, worked 2 jobs to support her younger brother, no criminal record, no financial fraud, no unexplained wealth. The chief of security closed another folder. "She appears ordinary." Nathaniel looked at the stack of files. "No," he answered calmly. "People don't change my mother's life by being ordinary." Meanwhile, Grace remained completely unaware that her past was slowly being uncovered. She had far more important concerns, like convincing Margaret that oatmeal cookies counted as a perfectly acceptable lunch. "They're made from oats. They're practically healthy." Margaret looked unconvinced. "They're still cookies." "They're optimistic vegetables." The older woman laughed. "You invent facts." "I improve them." Even the nurse standing nearby couldn't hide her smile anymore. The room felt lighter every day. That afternoon, Grace opened the poetry journal again. "I think I figured out why your husband liked this poem." Margaret looked at her with quiet curiosity. "It isn't about losing someone." Grace ran her fingers gently across the faded page. "It's about believing they'll find their way back." For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Then Margaret slowly reached for Grace's hand. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I waited. Grace squeezed her fingers gently. "I know." "So long." "I know." Tears gathered in the older woman's eyes. "I promised." Her breathing became uneven. "I promised." The sentence stopped there. No matter how hard she tried, the rest refused to come. Grace didn't ask another question. She simply sat beside her until the moment passed. Across the hallway, the psychiatrist quietly closed his notebook. Nathaniel looked at him. "What is it?" "I think we're approaching the memory." "The memory? The one everything else is attached to." "You sound certain." "I'm not," the doctor admitted. But trauma rarely returns as a complete picture. It returns like pieces of broken glass, a sound, a smell, a single sentence. He glanced toward the bedroom. Someone important is hidden inside those fragments. 3 days later, the chief of security entered Nathaniel's office, carrying another archive box. This one came from Street Catherine's hospital. Nathaniel immediately looked up. What is it? Volunteer records, community outreach, summer programs. The hospital had nearly destroyed them years ago. Fortunately, one storage clerk had ignored the order. Nathaniel opened the first folder himself. Most names meant nothing. Page after page passed beneath his fingers. Then he stopped, his eyes fixed on a single line. Grace Bennett, age 17, volunteer, Street Catherine's Hospital, Summer Trauma Support Program. The room became completely silent. The chief of security looked at him carefully. Sir. Nathaniel didn't answer. He continued staring at the page. Outside the window, rain began falling once again. Back in the East Wing, Grace was reading another poem to Margaret, completely unaware that 12 forgotten years had just begun catching up with both of them. Nathaniel slowly closed the folder. He finally understood one thing. His mother hadn't chosen Grace by accident, but he still didn't know why a frightened 17-year-old volunteer had become the last person his mother remembered before losing herself. The folder never left Nathaniel's desk. For 3 days, he opened it every morning. For 3 days, he closed it without mentioning a single word to Grace. The volunteer roster proved only one thing. 12 years ago, she had been inside Street, Catherine's hospital. It did not prove she had met his mother. It did not prove she was the girl Margaret remembered. Nathaniel had built an empire by acting on evidence instead of assumptions. He refused to abandon that rule now. Life inside the East Wing continued, as though nothing had changed. Grace still arrived every morning carrying something different. One day it was a mystery novel. Another day it was a box of colored pencils because she had decided everyone, regardless of age, deserved permission to color outside the lines. You know this is for children, Margaret observed. Grace nodded. So is ice cream. We still enjoy that. The older woman smiled. I suppose that's true. What Nathaniel hadn't expected was how often Grace disappeared when she wasn't with his mother. Not because she was avoiding work. Quite the opposite. She simply couldn't seem to walk through the mansion without helping someone. One afternoon, he found her in the kitchen. The pastry chef, a gray-haired man who had worked for the family for over 30 years, was trying to lift a heavy tray into the oven. Before anyone could react, Grace stepped beside him. Let me. I've got it. You also have a back that's at least 40 years younger than mine. The chef laughed. I survived raising 3 daughters, and I'd like you to survive retirement too. Together, they slid the tray into the oven. She dusted the flour from her hands and walked away as though nothing unusual had happened. The chef smiled to himself. Good girl. The following morning, she was in the garden. One of the groundskeepers was struggling to move a large ceramic planter after twisting his wrist. Grace didn't ask whose job it was. She simply grabbed the other side. On 3, the old gardener chuckled. I was going to ask one of the young men. You did? She grinned. I just happened to be prettier. Nathaniel watched everything from the library window. No one knew he was there. She never looked around to see whether anyone was watching. She never waited to be thanked. She helped and kept walking. That evening, he asked the estate manager a simple question. Has she always been like this? The older man looked confused. Miss Bennett? Yes. The manager smiled faintly. The staff have started arguing over who gets to work with her. Why? Because she makes difficult days feel shorter. Nathaniel said nothing. The answer stayed with him long after the conversation ended. The next afternoon, Grace walked into the East Wing carrying a bouquet of wildflowers. Not expensive roses, not imported orchids, just flowers gathered from the local market. Margaret looked at them with delight. They're beautiful. They cost $12. The older woman laughed. You weren't supposed to tell me that. I wanted you to know expensive isn't always better. She arranged the flowers in an old crystal vase. There. Perfect. Nathaniel happened to enter just as she finished. He looked at the arrangement. I could have had fresh orchids delivered. Grace didn't even turn around. I know. They would have cost $500. Probably. She smiled. These made her smile first. The sentence landed with unexpected force. For once, money hadn't improved anything. Presence had. The following day, Nathaniel made what he believed was a thoughtful gesture. A florist delivered nearly 200 white roses to the East Wing. The arrangement filled almost half the sitting room. Every employee admired it. Grace stared for several seconds. Then she sneezed once, twice, a third time. Her eyes watered instantly. Nathaniel frowned. "Are you ill?" She pointed weakly toward the flowers. "I'm allergic to your generosity." Even Margaret laughed so hard she needed to sit down. The florist quietly began removing the roses before Grace sneezed again. Nathaniel tried something else. The next morning, a velvet jewelry box appeared beside Grace's teacup. She opened it. Inside rested a pair of diamond earrings. She looked at them, closed the box, then placed 3 packets of sugar inside it. When Nathaniel entered later, he frowned. "What happened to the earrings?" "They're in the safe." "You put sugar in the box." "It keeps disappearing into the kitchen drawer. The box is organized." He looked at her for several seconds. "You use a jewelry case to store sugar." "It has little compartments." She shrugged. "They're very practical." Behind them, Margaret quietly covered her mouth to hide another laugh. Nothing Nathaniel offered seemed to impress her. Not the flowers, not the jewelry, not the luxury. She thanked him politely, then continued living exactly as she had before. It was unlike anyone he had ever met. One evening after Grace left for the day, Margaret looked toward her son. "You've been watching." Nathaniel didn't deny it. "I'm making observations." His mother smiled knowingly. "No, you've been learning." He sat beside her chair. "What have I learned?" Margaret reached for the poetry journal resting on the table. "You spent years trying to fix people." She gently closed the notebook. "She simply loves them." The room fell silent. For the first time, Nathaniel couldn't argue. The following week, he invited Grace to dinner, not at the mansion, at the finest restaurant in the city. She read the reservation card, looked up, then looked back at the card again. "May I ask something?" "Of course." "Do they serve French fries?" Nathaniel blinked. "I'm sure they can." She nodded thoughtfully. "If I can't order fries, I'm going to be very overdressed and deeply disappointed." Even Nathaniel couldn't stop the corner of his mouth from lifting. "I'll make sure they have fries." "Good." She smiled. "Then I'll consider your proposal." As he watched her leave the room, the realization arrived quietly. He wasn't inviting her to dinner because she had helped his mother. He wanted another hour of hearing her laugh. Another hour of watching the way she made everyone around her feel seen. Somewhere between the poetry, the crosswords, the flowers, and the impossible conversations, the reason he kept looking for excuses to be near her had changed. He simply hadn't admitted it to himself yet. The next morning, a sleek black car stopped outside the Whitmore estate. A woman stepped out wearing an elegant cream-colored suit and dark sunglasses. Every employee recognized her immediately. Isabella Kane, the woman who had once been expected to become Mrs. Whitmore. She removed her sunglasses and looked toward the East Wing. "I heard," she said coolly to the estate manager, "that Nathaniel has replaced me with a housekeeper." The manager remained politely silent. Isabella smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "Let's see what is so unforgettable about her." The invitation arrived on a quiet Thursday afternoon. It wasn't for a charity gala. It wasn't for another medical consultation. It was simply a dinner reservation. 1 table, 2 guests, no security, no business partners, no reporters, just a handwritten note. "If you're still willing to risk disappointing yourself over French fries, dinner is tomorrow." Grace smiled despite herself. She walked into Margaret's room holding the card. "I think your son is trying to bribe me with potatoes." The older woman looked over her reading glasses. "Will it work?" Grace pretended to think. "If the fries are crispy, possibly." Margaret laughed. "I always knew he would eventually learn." The restaurant overlooked the river. It was elegant enough to intimidate most people. Grace looked at the menu for nearly a minute before lowering it. "There aren't any fries." Nathaniel looked horrified. "I specifically asked them." A waiter hurried over. "We do have truffle fries, sir." Grace grinned. Crisis averted. For the first time in years, Nathaniel relaxed before the meal had even begun. They didn't talk about medicine or business or poetry. Instead, they talked about ordinary things. Grace confessed she still burned toast at least once a week. Nathaniel admitted he had no idea how to operate the washing machine in his own house. You've never done laundry. I own the machine. I didn't ask whether you owned it, she laughed. I asked whether you've used it. He quietly looked at his water glass. I may have outsourced adulthood. When dessert arrived, Nathaniel placed a thin folder on the table. Grace's smile faded. What is this? I owe you the truth. She opened the folder. Inside was a faded volunteer roster from Street Catherine's hospital. Her name appeared halfway down the page. She frowned. I remember volunteering there. Nathaniel remained silent. There are more pages. She turned another sheet. Old schedules, training records, community outreach assignments. Then a photocopy of a handwritten nursing note. Young female volunteer remained with unidentified trauma patient during emergency intake after family members could not be located. Patient became calmer while volunteer read from personal notebook. Grace stopped breathing. The words blurred. Fragments began surfacing without permission. A crowded emergency room, rain pounding against the windows, power flickering. A frightened older woman shaking uncontrollably. Someone pressing a worn notebook into her hands. She likes poetry. A tired nurse saying those words. Then a teenage girl sitting beside a stranger, reading. Not because she knew what else to do, but because no one should face terror alone. Grace slowly covered her mouth. Oh, tears filled her eyes. I remember. She looked up at Nathaniel. I never saw her face. There was blood. So many people. I thought she was just another patient. Nathaniel nodded quietly. You left before my family arrived. I never knew who you were. Neither of them spoke for several moments. Finally, Grace whispered, I didn't save your mother. I just stayed. Nathaniel smiled gently. Exactly. The following evening, the Whitmore Foundation hosted its annual fundraising gala for trauma recovery programs. It was Margaret's first public appearance in almost 2 years. Doctors advised against attending. She insisted. I'm ready. Grace offered to stay home. I don't want anyone talking about me. Margaret reached for her hand. They already are. The ballroom glittered with cameras and crystal chandeliers. Guests applauded as Margaret entered on her son's arm. Many wiped away tears. Few noticed the woman quietly walking several steps behind them. Isabella noticed immediately. So, she smiled coldly, the housekeeper made the guest list. Several reporters turned their cameras toward Grace. Isabella never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Interesting. A temporary employee somehow becomes the closest companion of one of the wealthiest families in the city. She looked directly at Grace. I suppose emotional manipulation pays better than housekeeping. A murmur spread through the crowd. Another reporter stepped forward. Miss Bennett, are you being compensated for your relationship with Mrs. Whitmore? Did you intentionally encourage emotional dependence? Are you romantically involved with Mr. Whitmore? The questions came faster, sharper, crueler. Isabella folded her arms. She isn't a doctor. She isn't family. She isn't qualified. Her smile widened. She is nobody. The ballroom fell silent. Grace looked toward Margaret. The older woman had begun breathing faster. Without another word, Grace stepped backward. If my being here is upsetting Mrs. Whitmore, I'll leave.
She would rather lose every accusation than risk Margaret's recovery.
She turned toward the exit. Then a voice stopped the entire room. It wasn't loud, but everyone heard it. Margaret slowly released her son's arm. For the first time since her illness began, she walked forward alone. One careful step, then another, until she stood beside Grace. The ballroom was so quiet that the clicking of cameras sounded almost deafening. Margaret gently took Grace's hand. When she finally spoke, her voice no longer trembled. When I had no voice, she gave me hers. No one moved. No one interrupted. She didn't know my name. She didn't know my family. She didn't know anyone would ever thank her. Another tear rolled down her cheek. She simply stayed. Nathaniel stepped forward without anger, without threats. He held up the hospital records. 12 years ago, he looked across the room. A 17-year-old volunteer sat beside an unidentified trauma patient throughout one of the busiest nights this city had ever seen. He opened the final page. She left before anyone could learn her name. He lowered the folder. She never asked for recognition. She never knew who that patient was. His gaze found Grace. My mother remembered her heart long before I remembered her name. Then he turned toward the crowd. You call her nobody because none of you ever bothered to learn who she was. Silence. Heavy. Unavoidable. Isabella's confidence finally cracked. She searched for another insult. None came. Margaret looked at her gently. You are very beautiful. Isabella managed a faint smile. Thank you. The older woman nodded. It is unfortunate that beauty is all you chose to bring. No one laughed. The truth was too painful. Isabella quietly lowered her eyes and walked away. Weeks later, life inside the Whitmore estate felt different. Not because every problem had disappeared. Margaret still forgot small things. Some mornings she repeated the same story twice. Some afternoons she struggled to remember what she had eaten for breakfast. But she never forgot one thing: who sat beside her. One autumn evening, the three of them gathered in the garden. The old poetry journal rested open on Margaret's lap. Grace began reading, not as therapy, not as treatment, simply because beautiful words still sounded better when spoken aloud. When she finished, Margaret closed the notebook and smiled at the two people beside her. I used to think she came back to save me. She reached for Grace's hand, then for Nathaniel's. I was wrong. She looked at her son with quiet pride. She came back to bring my son home. Nathaniel intertwined his fingers with Grace's. This time, she didn't pull away. He smiled. At first, I kept asking you to stay because my mother needed you. He took a slow breath.
Then I started looking for proof.
Proof that you were the girl she remembered. He laughed softly, and somewhere along the way, I found myself inventing excuses. Excuses to walk past that bedroom. Excuses to bring flowers. Excuses to invite you to dinner. He looked into her eyes. I thought I was trying to understand my mother's miracle. His voice softened. I didn't realize the miracle had already started happening to me. Grace smiled through tears. So, she asked playfully, was this all an elaborate plan to get me to eat French fries with you? Nathaniel nodded with complete seriousness. The fries were always the strategy. Margaret laughed, a warm, familiar laugh that drifted across the garden. This time, no one was afraid it would disappear again.